This week, we're going to be talking about writer's block. And to kick things off, I want to talk about something called decision fatigue that has a huge impact on how often you and I get writer's block. My name is Seth. I'm a full-time fantasy author. I've written 26 books. I've published most of them. And I make these videos because there are a lot of authors out there who don't feel like they're making it, and I don't want you to be one of them. So first of all, what is decision fatigue? In its most basic form, it's the stress that we are under when we have to make a lot of different decisions, especially when those decisions require a trade-off. A great example of that is that if you were to give somebody $100 and you were to send them into a grocery store with a long list of groceries to buy, say $120 worth of groceries to buy, and they had to make a lot of decisions about each individual thing that they're trying to buy, when they get to the register, they would be more likely to have experienced decision fatigue. That is, their ability to make good decisions would have degraded throughout this experience. On the other hand, if you give somebody $500 and you tell them to go in and buy $120 worth of food, they're probably going to waltz through the store, throwing things in their cart, getting whatever they want because they have plenty of money to do it with. Well, we can have decision fatigue in writing as well. And the further down this road we go, the more fatigued we become, the more likely it is that we encounter writer's block. Decision fatigue for writers often manifests as avoidance. That is, the pushing off of decisions because we simply don't have the mental or spiritual strength in order to make them. You may have had this experience where you're working on a manuscript and you just sort of lose sight of the plot and you're not sure how to get the threads back together. And so you start actively avoiding putting the story back together. Or maybe there are just so many different pieces to it. Maybe the plot has all of these different threads that you're trying to navigate, and you find yourself just not making decisions. This is a symptom of decision fatigue, the state where you are tapped out. You just don't have the energy to make choices about your story. This is surprisingly common, and even for authors who have been at this for a long time, it can happen, especially if we're not careful and we're not paying attention to our mental and physical state as we're writing. What often starts as avoidance, not wanting to make a decision, can transform into paralysis, the inability to make a decision. And when that happens, it's not so much that you don't want to make a decision. You do want to make a decision, and that's actually the problem, because you want to make the right decision. But when we're presented with a ton of different options and all of them seem about equally good, often it can be paralyzing because we cannot determine the right decision. And because we can't determine the right decision, we just default to not making a decision, which weirdly is a decision in and of itself. This stuff gets really complicated, and I don't know, this stuff gets pretty warped. So the question is, how do we overcome decision fatigue? If we find ourselves in that spot where we're just not making decisions, we're not making forward progress, what do we do? Well, I like to move back to first principles whenever possible. I like to try to understand what it is we are operating out of, what sort of principle we're operating out of that causes us to make our choices, to make our decisions, or in this case, not make our decisions. And I think at the core of decision fatigue is an interesting conundrum. And there's actually research to back this up. Decision fatigue is observed more often in people who believe in decision fatigue. Let me repeat that to make sure you got it. People who experience decision fatigue are people who believe that making choices gets progressively harder. That after completing a task, they would be drained of energy and they would have a harder time making decisions. On the contrary, people who don't believe in limited willpower, people who don't believe that making decisions gets harder typically perform better. So what does this point to? Well, it points to fear of the future being a real problem. As a writer, I feel like fear of the future is something that sits with me every day. How is this going to turn out? Is my manuscript going to be good? Is my writing actually improving? Am I just going to be stuck here forever? Will my next manuscript sell? All of these are questions that run through writers' heads every day. But they're not helpful questions. I mean, yeah, we need to think about the future. We need to be able to plan for forward progress. But it's not actually helpful for me to dwell in that place. And rather than worrying about it, the best thing for me to do is to keep making decisions. Even when I feel tired, even when I feel like I don't know what the best decision is, I need to just make decisions and move forward. Because we're temporally bound, humans have this strange fixation on the present. And what I mean by that is that it can be really hard to realize that your present moment isn't the only moment. Sure, we think about the future and we think about the past, but we live in the present. And often we get so caught up in what we're doing right now and the importance of it that we place all of our hopes on it. We don't actually allow ourselves to understand that the decision we make now does have an impact on the future. But we're going to have the opportunity to make a lot more decisions moving forward. And as long as those decisions keep getting better, we're going to make progress, we're going to improve. As a side note, I think that this is why it's so vitally important that we write every day or as close to it as possible. That progressive repetition of writing every day forces us into forward progress. It forces us into making decisions. So if you have writer's block, if you're finding it difficult to sit down and write, you might want to consider this. Is this a matter of decision fatigue? Are you choosing avoidance because you don't want to make decisions, because you don't know which is the best decision? And if you do find yourself in that place, then your only option is to just start making decisions, is to just start moving. And so I would encourage you, if you don't already have a writing habit, try to develop one. There's tons of information on how to do that online, and I have a couple of videos on it as well. But building a writing habit is probably the single best way we can overcome this decision fatigue as a writer.